Beyond the Gates, spoilers reveal that at Fairmont Crest, the most dangerous storms were never the ones people saw coming. They did not arrive with broken windows, police sirens, or blood on marble floors. They began in silence, in glances held a second too long, in whispered reassurances that felt too perfect to be true, in the slow and almost beautiful collapse of boundaries that should never have been crossed. There was something especially terrifying about the kind of danger that dressed itself as comfort. It slipped into the heart before the mind could name it. It convinced people they were healing, when in truth, they were only surrendering to a different kind of ruin. That was the darkness now forming around Vanessa and Joey. What had once looked like unexpected tenderness, like a refuge built between two lonely souls who had spent too much of life pretending not to ache, was beginning to reveal another face. It was becoming an obsession. Not the loud, reckless sort that explodes in public, but the quieter, more poisonous kind that rewrites loyalties, distorts judgment, and turns love into a weapon before either person fully understands what has happened. And the deeper Vanessa moved into Joey's orbit, the more one terrible question hovered over everything. Was she becoming the woman who would finally soften Joey, or the woman whose presence would trigger the most dangerous shift of his life? Vanessa had not gone looking for this. That was what made it feel so cruel. She had not chased power. She had not dreamed of being attached to a man whose name carried influence, fear, and the kind of unspoken authority that made entire rooms change posture when he entered. What she had wanted was much simpler and therefore much more dangerous. She had wanted relief. She had wanted to breathe without feeling the weight of grief pressing down on her ribs. She had wanted one place in her life where she did not have to be the strong one, the composed one, the woman forever cleaning up emotional wreckage left behind by other people's damage. Joey had seen that need in her before she was willing to admit it to herself. He had recognized exhaustion in the way she smiled too quickly, pain in the way she spoke about her daughter, loneliness in the spaces between her sentences. He knew how to step into those fractures with unnerving precision. He did not overwhelm her at first. He steadied her. He let her lean without making her feel weak. He made her feel chosen. And for a woman who had spent too long surviving disappointment, that feeling was more intoxicating than she wanted to admit. But the sweetness of being chosen by Joey came with a cost Vanessa had not measured correctly in the beginning. A man like Joey never existed in only one dimension. He could not simply be affectionate. He could not simply be attentive. Everything around him was tied to structures larger than romance. Business, alliances, rivalries, debts, favors, hidden motives, old sins still breathing beneath polished surfaces. To be close to him was to stand near the center of a machine that never fully stopped moving. And slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, Vanessa began to understand that her connection to Joey was no longer private. It was no longer just a fragile emotional bond unfolding behind closed doors. Her presence beside him had started to mean something to other people. They studied her differently. They measured her words more carefully. Some treated her with a sudden courtesy that felt less like respect than caution. Others looked at her with suspicion, as though she had crossed an invisible line and become part of something she still did not understand. It was then that fear truly began to bloom. Vanessa realized that simply being loved by Joey might be enough to pull her into the architecture of his world, whether she consented to it or not. That realization tore at her more than she expected, because part of her hated how powerful it felt. After so much helplessness, after so many moments in life where she had been forced to endure rather than shape events, there was a dark thrill in sensing that the ground shifted now when she walked into certain rooms. It disgusted her. It tempted her. It made her angry with Joey for awakening a hunger she had spent years suppressing. She wanted to believe she was still untouched by that kind of seduction, still morally separate from the dangerous glamour surrounding him, but every day made that claim harder to defend. The truth was that Joey did not merely make her feel desired. He made her feel defended, and defense can become addictive when a woman has lived too long in emotional siege. Vanessa started asking herself questions she could not answer without shame. Was she holding on to Joey because she loved him, or because loving him had begun to feel like the safest position in a world where safety was always temporary? Was she protecting her heart, or was she quietly surrendering it in exchange for proximity to a power she once would have mistrusted? Joey saw the conflict in her, and instead of stepping back, he moved closer. That was his weakness, or perhaps it was his truest form of selfishness. He told himself that Vanessa deserved comfort, protection, clarity, but beneath all those noble instincts was something far less clean. He wanted her, not casually, not in the shallow way he had wanted other women before. He wanted her with the dangerous intensity of a man who had gone too long without allowing himself genuine attachment and now found the experience both exhilarating and intolerable. Vanessa mattered to him in a way that made him feel exposed. Her pain affected him. Her distance unsettled him. Her approval mattered more than it should have. He hated that about himself almost as much as he cherished it. He had spent years building a life where emotion answered to discipline, where sentiment never interfered with strategy, where nothing and no one could become so important that they threatened his control. Then Vanessa entered that system and altered its center of gravity. Suddenly he was imagining permanence, and permanence was a risk he had never believed in enough to pursue. What frightened Joey most was not that he could lose Vanessa, it was that he could destroy her while trying to keep her. He knew the nature of the world he inhabited. He knew how fast softness could be exploited, how quickly enemies could detect a vulnerability once it began to matter. The closer Vanessa came, the more visible she became. Joey's instincts sharpened. He grew more suspicious, more territorial, more willing to act before threats had fully formed. That change did not go unnoticed. People around him began to sense volatility where there had once been calculation. He was still composed, still controlled on the surface, but beneath that polish there was a new urgency. He was no longer merely protecting territory or reputation. He was protecting a future he had not meant to want. And a man like Joey, once given something precious to lose, became more dangerous than ever. The damage deepened when whispers began to spread that Vanessa's role in Joey's life might soon extend beyond the personal. No one needed proof. In places like Fairmont Crest, rumors hardened into social reality long before facts arrived. All it took was a few changed behaviors, a few careful silences, a few moments when people deferred to Vanessa in ways they never had before. Suddenly, the idea of Vanessa having influence inside Joey's organization no longer seemed impossible. Whether she wanted that role or not ceased to matter. Others were already assigning it to her. That was the moment her romance with Joey transformed into something darker. The relationship stopped being only about need, healing, and desire. It became political, dangerous, symbolic. Vanessa was no longer just a woman being loved, she was a woman being positioned. She felt that shift in her bones. It entered her like cold water. Conversations that used to feel tender now carried undertones she could not ignore. Invitations from Joey started to feel layered, as though every act of closeness also carried an unspoken test. Even his generosity unsettled her. The comfort he offered was real, but it was never simple. Every gift, every reassurance, every moment of protection seemed to ask something of her without saying it outright. Not obedience exactly, not loyalty in any crude sense. Something more intimate and therefore more frightening. Trust. Total trust. The kind of trust that requires a person to stop asking where the walls are closing in. Vanessa wanted to believe in that surrender. She wanted to believe that this was one rare love strong enough to survive the ugliness around it. But she had lived too long with disappointment to ignore the pattern emerging beneath the romance. Joey's world did not absorb people gently. It marked them, changed them, claimed them. And still she could not walk away. That helplessness made her furious. She had spent too much of her life fighting not to become dependent on any man's protection, any man's mood, any man's promise. Yet Joey had reached a part of her far deeper than pride. He had made himself essential not by controlling her, but by understanding her. That made him harder to resist and harder to forgive. Vanessa began to resent the tenderness between them because it blurred every moral line she had once trusted. She found herself defending him in her thoughts before she even knew the facts. She found herself tolerating omissions because his presence softened the loneliness she could not bear to revisit. Each concession humiliated her. She could feel herself changing and did not know whether to call it growth or corruption. Her anger became layered. Anger at Joey for drawing her into something so complicated, anger at the world for making power feel safer than innocence, anger at herself for responding to him with longing even when her instincts warned her to run. Joey, meanwhile, was becoming trapped inside a contradiction he could not resolve. He wanted Vanessa close enough to trust him, but far enough to remain untouched by the violence of his reality. He wanted to offer her a future, but he also wanted to keep control over every path leading to it. He told himself his secrecy was a form of protection, yet he knew better. Secrecy was also habit. It was how he survived. He did not know how to love transparently because transparency had never kept him alive. So he rationed truth. He softened certain details. He omitted the ugliest parts. He chose what Vanessa should know and when she should know it. In his mind, it was mercy. In hers, Once she began to see it clearly, it looked too much like betrayal. That wound cut deeper than either of them expected. Vanessa did not need Joey to be innocent. She was not naive enough to ask for that, but she needed him to stop deciding for her which dangers she was allowed to understand. The more she sensed his protective half-truths, the more she felt reduced, managed, gently cornered by a man who claimed to value her strength while quietly denying her the information necessary to use it. It became unbearable because Joey's tenderness was sincere. If he had been cold, she could have hated him cleanly. If he had been manipulative in an obvious way, she could have left with her dignity intact. But he loved her in a manner that felt real even while it restricted her. He cared for her while keeping parts of his world hidden. He reached for her with one hand and controlled the frame around her with the other. That duality poisoned everything. As Vanessa's suspicions sharpened, so did her sense of being watched by forces beyond Joey himself. She began to understand that loving a man like him meant inheriting his enemies long before she ever met them. A look lingered too long, a call ended too abruptly. A conversation in a room changed when she entered. She started piecing together the terrifying possibility that her growing bond with Joey had already triggered movement around them. Plans were adjusting. Old tensions were resurfacing. People were calculating not just what Joey might do next, but what Vanessa might mean to those decisions. She became a pressure point without ever choosing to be one. That knowledge filled her with dread because it meant her life was no longer entirely her own. Even her emotional choices had become strategic terrain for other people. And that was when the obsession truly turned ugly. Vanessa stopped asking whether she and Joey were good for each other, and began asking what would be left of her if she stayed. She saw how easily devotion could become dependency. She saw how longing could mutate into loyalty to things she did not believe in. She saw how Joey's protection, once the sweetest thing he offered, had started to resemble possession disguised as care. The worst part was that he did not even fully realize he was doing it. He thought he was building a shield around her. In reality, he was closing a circle. Every time he acted in her name, every time he made a decision meant to keep danger away from her, he tightened her connection to the very machinery that frightened her. Joey felt the shift too, and it enraged him because he had no language for a love that did not eventually involve control. He had spent too many years equating protection with authority. Now Vanessa's resistance forced him to confront the possibility that what he called devotion might look, from her side, like erasure. He could feel her pulling inward, becoming more watchful, harder to reassure. That triggered something primitive in him, something dark and defensive. The more he feared losing her, the more aggressively he wanted to secure what remained between them. That instinct made him unpredictable. He became quicker to close ranks, quicker to silence threats, quicker to imagine worst-case scenarios and act on them. His plans, once disciplined and measured, began to acquire a sharper edge. People around him sensed it. The balance of his world started to tremble. Vanessa, caught in the center of that tremor, understood with growing horror that she had become both Joey's comfort and his fracture point. She was the place where his carefully managed life stopped behaving predictably. She was the weakness his enemies could smell. She was also the mirror reflecting back the man he really was when strategy fell away. And that man, for all his passion and intensity, was still capable of devastating choices when cornered. Loving him meant living close to that truth. It meant accepting that his heartbreak would not make him gentle. It might make him merciless. The cruelest irony was that this relationship had begun to give Vanessa exactly what she had once believed she needed. Joey made her feel desired, protected, significant, alive. He awakened parts of her that grief had nearly buried. He made the future shimmer again, but the brighter that future seemed, the more impossible it became to ignore the shadow attached to it. Fairmont Crest was already shifting around them. Lines were being drawn. Loyalties were hardening. Whatever Joey had planned for his empire, Vanessa's presence was now changing the shape of it. Whether through love, fear, or desperation, he was making different choices because of her. And those choices were beginning to look less like romance and more like the first tremors before an explosion. By then, neither of them could return to the illusion that this was just a private affair. Their bond had become a force. It had entered the bloodstream of Joey's world and altered its rhythm. Vanessa was no longer simply the woman he wanted beside him. She was becoming central to decisions that could wound families, destabilize alliances, and turn hidden tensions into open warfare. Joey was no longer simply the man who comforted her in her loneliness. He was becoming the architect of a future that might demand more of her than love alone could justify. And somewhere inside all that desire, fear, and gathering violence lay the most devastating truth of all. Both of them might be sincere, and sincerity might not save them. They could love each other honestly and still destroy everything around them. They could reach for intimacy and find themselves swallowed by consequence. They could believe they were building something rare and beautiful while the ground beneath them quietly cracked open. That was the real horror taking shape around Vanessa and Joey. Not that their feelings were false, but that they were real enough to matter in a world where anything that matters becomes a target. Real enough to provoke envy, real enough to inspire betrayal. Real enough to turn one woman's dream into the pressure point of a much larger war. So when Fairmont Crest finally begins to feel the full force of what Vanessa and Joey have become to each other, it will not arrive as a simple love story. It will come as a reckoning. A collision between longing and power, between vulnerability and control, between the desperate human need to be chosen and the terrible price of being chosen by the wrong man at the wrong time. Vanessa may think she is standing on the edge of a new life. Joey may think he is finally claiming something worth protecting, but the closer they move toward each other, the clearer it becomes that this connection is not calming the chaos around them, it is feeding it. And once that fire is fully lit, neither love nor regret may be enough to put it out.